YouTube and welcome back to the channel and episode 3 of Project ZXR400RR. And as many of you may hear in my voice, I've been suffering with man flu. So I've not been doing fantastic the past couple of weeks. When I get ill these days, it just knocks me out. But I'm in the garage today. We've got the heating on, my beanie, and a new channel partner, which we'll discuss shortly. But what I do need to bring you up to speed with is something I discovered about the ZXR400, well, I thought I discovered, that was going to change the outcome of the entire project. So I was in France 2 weeks ago snowboarding, fantastic time, and I got a comment saying, I think I know this bike, there's not many of them in purple, it's got a pretty serious gearbox problem, if that's the bike. I think it is. And obviously at the time I was in France, beers away, I was like, well, it'll be what it'll be, it was a cheap bike. And then when I came back to the UK, I thought, do you know what? I probably should check this out before I get everything done and ready to ride it, because we had that where there was no engine bolts in there. So I was like, that's weird. Has someone removed the engine? Which then starts ringing some home truths as to maybe the engine had been removed because there was a problem. But I've got some new bolts in there now, so I'm not too worried about that. Everything lined up there. But let me show you something. And at first I was like, yeah, the gearbox is done. The bike is broken because of this. So neutral, as you'd expect. First gear, lovely. Neutral again, perfect. First gear, now let's go to second. Back down to first. Up to second. Ooh, why is that? Not ideal. But what it turns out is, this is my first Kawasaki I've ever actually owned, is they have something called a neutral assist. So you can't actually go from first to second unless the whole gearbox assembly is moving at speed. So you can't hit second when you're in idle. So fingers crossed, it looks like that's okay on that side of things. But what I need to do today is rig the bike up and at least take it for a little ride down the garden footpath to actually make sure I can engage second gear. Because if I can't, this project is done. But yeah, anyway, let's get into the episode. And also want to say that I've now teamed up, as we mentioned, with the beanie hat with XCP. So a new product to the channel, a new partner, and I feel they're going to be a fantastic fit. But we'll discuss that later in the episode. Those that are familiar, the original fuel tank that we got with the bike isn't quite ready to go just yet. So it's removed and put to one side. But I do have a genuine seal kit to go on that. But what I needed to do first was make sure that I could actually use this gearbox. And in order to do that, I needed to use my little temporary fuel pot just so we could ride it down the garden footpath. Because for me, if the gearbox doesn't work, this project is dead in the water. With the temporary fuel tank in place, it was finally time to put some fresh unleaded in it and get the old girl ready to fire up. Now, this is definitely something I wouldn't recommend at home. The potential for disaster is huge. Imagine dropping the bike, this little fuel can, link everywhere. It's, yeah, definitely not something I would consider as a good option. But for me, going down the garden footpath, it was going to be a quick test to find out whether this project was likely to be any further beyond this episode. As I drained the carburetor previously, that little bottle of about 400ml soon disappeared. So we were going to need to do another top up, because the last thing I wanted to do was have it cut out, as I was just about to find out whether the gearbox was working. But essentially, once it's filled back up, I then need to wiggle it out of the workshop and onto the garden footpath. And I do need to be careful here, because not only is it wet and cold, but this footpath isn't exactly the most grippy with very old tyres. So I wasn't going to be doing anything crazy, as I didn't want to end up in the missus's pink cabin down the bottom of the garden.
good news is the bike goes into second gear. The bad news is I didn't realise my missus was shooting a reel down in her studio.
Sorry if you can hear a motorbike going in the background. As many of you know, I have a petrol head partner, and as all my shoots are done for the day, he's decided now to drive the motorbike down the pathway. It's like having a child. This is what I have to put up with when you guys go.
Thankfully, I do have a very understanding missus. She has to put up with a lot of my petrol head nightmares. I'm not the easiest person to live with, as I am constantly tinkering, as you guys watching the video. But this is a good news day. I think the gearbox is alright, and it makes sense now with that Kawasaki neutral assist, because the bike felt like it went into second gear perfectly on both occasions. And I must say, the engine sounds absolutely sweet, especially after we did that compression test. So I'm glad at this stage I haven't got to pull it apart. But obviously, the real test is going to be when we get it to MOT. But let's just have one quick listen at that little Super 400cc scream away on the spot. As I mentioned in the intro, I've partnered up with XCP Professional, a new product to me and to the channel. And I'm going to explain why I teamed up with them. So they actually reached out to me and said they have a range of products that will be perfect for the projects I do on these bikes. And I'm going to be honest, you always take these things with a pinch of salt. And that's till I saw the video from my old friend John, who I went on the trip to the next factory with. And I'll leave a link at the description at the end. But ultimately, it makes ACF 50 look like tap water for protection. So I'm really excited to try this. And if you want to see how impressive this stuff is, buy an independent tester. Check the video at the end that I'll link for John's one, which is absolutely fantastic. Really geeked out on the experiment that he completed on these for testing against corrosion. Remember that old junk bodywork that I got with the bike? Well, I'm glad I didn't throw it away, because now I wanted to get the bike on the road and actually see if the gearbox worked fully through all 6 gears and that it was going to pass an MOT. And in order to do that, I needed to have some bodywork. Now, I wasn't willing to buy the replacement Chinese fairing at this point, just in case it was toast, because ultimately it'd be a complete waste of time and money. And although the bodywork looked pretty shabby, it would certainly do the job in getting it through the MOT. My biggest concern was how that nose cone would hold up, because ultimately that was all bent and warped. But anyway, let's get the bodywork back on and try and make it look like an actual motorcycle that could be placed on the road. As I mentioned, the bodywork was a little bit tatty. What I hadn't realised is there were quite a few cracks in the panel themselves. Real shame, because these are genuine, but given the age of the bike, it's to be expected. So I make sure I give everything a good clean, and then using the XCP a good degrease, because I do that cleaner in the can, and then we can look to plastic weld some of the panels. Now, these are never typically as strong as original, but I've had some really good success in the past of super gluing and then using a solder iron to fuse it together. There are other methods with using hot staples in there which seem to work, but to be honest with you, it's not a high stress point. This fairing is not going to be under a lot of load, and hopefully it should hold together for the road test. This is another one of them videos, do as I say, not as I do. As you can see here, I'm inside the garage doing this. I would highly suggest doing it in a well ventilated area, as those plastic fumes are nasty. With the rear fairing repaired, it's good to go back on the bike. Yes, it does look tatty, it is scuffed and scraped, but at least it's going to hold itself together. Hopefully, for the test ride to the MOT. But essentially, both side fairings on the rear go on and the seats. But what I do realise is they are going to have to come back off slightly on the front, just so I can get the fuel tank on. But just to mock the bike up for this time, it was a good excuse to see how that old 90s classic was taking shape. I managed to dig the rest of the bodywork out from the bottom of the garden. Thankfully, I didn't throw this away, but the nose cone was really not looking fantastic at all. And I even questioned myself whether this was going to even be remotely savable. But the first job was to get the side fairings on. Now, again, this panel had some cracks and some issues. It certainly wasn't perfect. Even though it was an original, it obviously had years of abuse. But the good news is the right and the left lower fairings all bolted up and used the existing point so that we could at least get the bike resembling a motorbike again. With both of the lower side fairings on, it was time to tackle that nose cone. Yeah, doesn't look great, does it? So my thought process, as I had an original clear screen, always preferred the clears over the tinted, personal opinion, I thought, do you know what? It's pretty sturdy. It might just give enough structure to the nose cone so it will hold shape for me to assemble it. Would I want to go to the Isle of Man and try and top this thing out? No, I don't think that nose cone's got that sort of life in it. But if we can get it to MOT and it passes, it's done everything I could ask it to do. So essentially, I start using the old spare Aprilia RS125 screws I have lying around the workshop. Yeah, it's turning into a bit of a Frankenstein. I get that. But essentially, it does start to take some shape. The screen had been left in Johnny's garage. It had been rolling around the back of the van when we collected it. It then ended up being left down the side of the house. It wasn't looking fantastic, and I had an old bottle of tea-cut that really I should have thrown away. But I thought, you know what, this might actually help lift a few of the marks, and I'm pleased to say it did actually bring it up much better than it was before. Again, I'm not going to be doing high speeds on this trying to actually look through it, but it looks more presentable than the current state of when I fitted it. At least I think so anyway. I'm not completely sure what was going through someone's mind to drill 2 large holes in a hugger when its purpose is to protect dirt and grime from entering the rear of the bike and the suspension components. But hey, I hope they had fun doing it, but sadly they've ruined this part, and thankfully it doesn't look horrific once it's fitted because you can't see the holes. But I'm kind of hoping by having that chain guard in place that if the chain did fail, even though it is only plastic, it might save my calf muscle ever so slightly if it was to snap. But let's hope we don't have to test that theory ever. Some goodies arrived from China and I managed to find the box with 2 spare headlights that Johnny included with a bike. So essentially I needed to get them onto the nose cone. The problem was 2 of the fixings were broken on the bottom of the fiberglass fairing. It doesn't surprise me. The fit is actually pretty awful, but the headlight assembly does go into the nose cone. Granted, it doesn't sit flush, so God knows what the headlight alignment's going to be like. The good news is there is an adjuster on the actual headlight unit itself, so fingers crossed I can get this set up when it goes for an MOT. Not that I'm going to do any night riding, but it's not going to pass an MOT if it can't see straight across the road without blinding everyone. The fiberglass nose cone sort of fits to the original points, maybe needing a little massage in places just to get it to hook into position. And then those new Chinese mirrors, which actually seem to be half decent looking at the quality of them on the bike, hold the upper in place. Now the lower part bolts to the lower side fairings. A few tabs are broken, things are a bit warped. As you're starting it again, get the picture. This is not going together how I would like in an ideal situation, but it's on, it's solid, and then it's just a case of testing if the headlight unit actually works after getting it all bolted up. All that was left to do then was fit the new indicators. Now I was given a set of indicators for the rear, but in the box of bits I couldn't find any front ones. Thankfully, again, there was a company in China for eBay that built these replica ones. I think they're about £13 each delivered. And they came with like a bracket on the back which enabled them to go straight onto the fairing. And I've got to be honest, as time's gone on, I actually prefer the retro look of the big indicators. Not sure why, let me know in the comments. What about yourselves? Stick to the old school or go with these new little mini ones, which I just don't think fit the lines of the bike these days. But anyway, they're on and we've got indicators working. Johnny, the previous owner, had sandblasted the fuel tank. It hadn't been covered since then, so small amounts of surface rust had started to occur. The tank isn't perfect, so I wasn't fussed about making this a fantastic job, but we did need to get it protected to avoid further damage. So essentially, using a Scotch-Brite pad, I go around the entire tank, trying to remove any of the surface rust that I can by hand. I then fully degrease the exterior of the tank so that when I put down the primer I don't have any reactions, and then it's simply a case of taking the tank outside and I'm going to get the airline and flush it all through. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's been sandblasted, which means sand gets absolutely everywhere, and the last thing I want is it going into my new fuel filter. And granted, the fuel filter should catch all the contaminants, but we don't want to make it work any harder than it has to. So quick airline out, and then I flush it through with some brake cleaner internally to watch out as much as possible. Regular followers to the channel will know I do like a little bit of rattle canning, and I didn't do too badly with the Aprilia RS125 project. Sure, it's not perfect, but man, I'm still thrilled that I managed to pull that off in the winter in a garage with rattle cans and very little experience. Unfortunately, the fuel tank that we're going to be doing today, I'm not giving that time and attention. Again, it needs some repairs doing on it because there's some dents in there. I'm just going to get a primer down, get some protection on it, and then just rattle can it black, just so the rust doesn't get any worse. Because whatever happens, whoever has to deal with this in the future, I kind of hope I'm going to help them a little bit of pain by preserving as much as I can than actually just leaving it raw and rusting further. The black finish was certainly a million times better than the raw steel, and as I mentioned, it's going to give it some element of protection. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't perfect. I think something is wrong with that primer that I used. It was an old can that was in the garage. I'd had it years. Whether it was too cold, I don't know. But either way, it's on there now, and it's going to provide the protection we need from the elements, at least I hope. So what we needed to do was get the fuel tank back into the garage and fit the new fuel tank seal kit. Now essentially I did a quick test off camera where I put the airline on the fuel tap and it was blowing back out when it was in the off position. So there was definitely something wrong with the internals, and the seal that actually bolts to the tank was also split in 2 or 3 places. So it wasn't perfect. But new kit, again, I got off of eBay. I think this was only about £12–13 delivered, and it hopefully should fix our problem. With the fuel tap all mounted up and the new screws and seals, you'd think this was the end of my problems. I did a quick test again off camera and it leaked. Not ideal, but I'm glad I did this before fitting it on the bike, and unfortunately in my hastiness of just wanting to get things done, I didn't film it. But essentially where it was leaking from is the 2 screws are actually an open thread into the fuel tank, so they do need some sort of sealing washer on there, and the bolts included weren't long enough. So what I did was use some slightly longer bolts with some copper sealing washers and then put it back in again. And pleased to report, it holds fluid absolutely perfectly, as the last thing you want is a leak anywhere with unleaded, especially running down onto an exhaust. The fuel tank paint was still relatively soft, so I had to be very careful positioning it back onto the bike. And essentially, you lower it down, you need those 2 rear side fairings really removed, but you can undo the front bolts and primer parts so the tank sits in, and then it's a case of picking up the fuel line and connecting it to the tank, and then using the original fixing points to bolt it all down. Now the problem is I don't have a lot of these screws. It looks like a lot of bits have been discontinued from Kawasaki, so I had to make do with some bits I've had in the workshop until I can source some suitable replacements. I'm pleased to confirm that in those box of fairings and bits and bobs and plastics, I actually had the bit of cowl fairing that goes over the front of the fuel tank. Now, I originally didn't think I had this, and when I had a look online, it's anywhere from £40 to £100. So I'm really glad this wasn't thrown away, because it nearly was. And that's why I always said, even when we collected the bike, take everything you can, because it's very easy to start adding the price up when you need bits, especially when they're already there. The problem is the air feeds that go from the front fairing into that little cowl and into the airbox were heavily corroded. They need replacing, but again, this is going to work fine for the MOT. Essentially, it's like drilling your airbox. I should get a lot more intake noise because these pipes are open and they'll feed sweet intake noise to my ears, but for performance, cold airflow, they're going to need to be replaced at a later date. But as we've said before, we just need to get it to MOT, and yeah, I probably should have left them off because they don't look fantastic at all, but at least they're there, and we know there's some sort of airflow going from the nose cone into the airbox. The bike didn't come with a fuel cap. Now obviously we're going to need this to pass the MOT, and to be honest with you, I wouldn't want to ride something with an open can on it full of unleaded. The problem was, if I bought an original one, I was either going to have a separate key, or I was going to have to change all the locks on the ignition, the seat, yada yada yada, you get it. I'm looking for a quick solution here. And again, eBay came through with this CNC cap. I don't think it's really period correct for the bike, but ultimately it's quite discreet in the black and it bolts on. We don't need a key. It's a quick solution so that we can get the bike for an MOT. So the decision was made to buy one and fit it. With the newly refurbished tank and fuel cap all in position, it was finally time to fill it up with unleaded, put that reserve tap on, and see if it was happy to start. Now every time I'd been taking the bike apart, I'd actually been draining the bowls because I didn't want the fuel to go off that was in there. So it does take a couple of seconds to reprime this, but it'll be good to see how it runs and starts when we get it for MOT. As I had a can of the XCP Professional Chain Lubricant, I thought, you know what, this is the perfect opportunity to try it out. Goes on absolutely lovely, so it'll be interesting to see how it is on the road. But I did have a little sneak peek online at reviews from distributors, and do you know what? It actually looks like it's going to be really good stuff. So with that completed, the chain looking fresh, it was then just on to checking the tyre pressures. Now I'd actually overinflated these to help moving the bike around the workshop, but now I just needed to drop them down just a smidge so it was ready for the road ride. My only slight concern was cold, wet weather, and very old tyres. I think these were dated like 12, 13 years old, so they were certainly past their best. It's going to be an easy ride, guys and girls, that's for sure. As always, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you hit that like and consider subscribing, as it really helps the channel. In the next video, we'll be going for MOT. Fingers crossed it passes. Then we'll be doing the road review on the bike. And finally, we'll be making the decision on the outcome of the bike. Does it stay? Does it go? Do we turn it into a race bike and enter a 400cc race series? Who knows? But let's see if that gearbox works first. Until the next one, see you then.